Eamon Kittredge slammed the door as a city inspector unfolded an eviction order, while 25 neighbors huddled inside his mud and straw house, their breath finally steady. Outside, Minneapolis was in a snow emergency. A transformer had blown near Target Field Station, and the cold was sending people to Hennepin County Medical Center. Weeks earlier, they'd laughed at the old couple loading straw into a 2004 Buick LeSabre. Now that joke was the only warm place left. Will the inspector seal the door, or remember who once saved him? Like and subscribe. Where are you watching from? The back lot of the Menards off Central Avenue NE buzzed with the usual early fall crowd. Contractors picking up insulation, young couples comparing paint colors, and retirees like Eamon Kittredge, who didn't browse so much as execute. His list was written in pencil, in the same all-caps handwriting he'd used since his apprentice days as a stonemason. This time, however, the cart wasn't filled with typical hardware store fare. It carried 8 dense bales of straw, 4 heavy sacks of damp clay, and a half-dozen bundles of reclaimed cedar lath, the kind usually tossed behind tool sheds. "You sure about this?" Lenora had asked that morning as she handed him his thermos of dark roast. Now she stood on the passenger side of their dusty 2004 Buick LeSabre, adjusting the bags to prevent sliding. "Sure as I've ever been," Eamon had said, though his tone betrayed the weight of something heavier than the clay. They'd done stranger things in their youth, during long Minnesota winters, before central heating was reliable, before their old house on Jefferson Street NE had been retrofitted beyond recognition. The couple worked methodically. Eamon's flannel cuffs turned back to reveal wrists lined with the kind of calluses that told a story longer than most people's resumes. Then came the laughter. Short, clipped, careless. A group of teenagers leaning on a red Chevy Silverado, smartphones tilted like weapons. One of them zoomed in on the straw. "Dude, it's like Pioneer cosplay. The hell is he building, a hobbit house?" Another chimed in. "Look at Grandma with the mud bricks. This is some Flintstones level click." A video, a caption, a few hashtags. Before Eamon even lifted the final sack, the internet had already named them the Mud Couple. By the time the LeSabre crossed Lowry Avenue Bridge on the drive home, the clip had already been reposted twice. One version had background music, a banjo loop overlaid with snorting laughter. Lenora didn't use social media, but the tension on Eamon's face grew with every stoplight check of his Samsung Galaxy S9, where the group chat from the neighborhood had lit up. "Seen this?" someone had messaged. Another added, "Didn't know y'all were doing medieval renovations." The jokes came fast, aggressive in their casual cruelty. People they had waved to on walks, the guy from the Cub Foods produce section, even the secretary from their old church, now all laughing from behind profile pictures. Eamon put the phone down by the time they reached their driveway in Wyndham Park, a modest 2-story house that hadn't been updated since Clinton's first term. The front porch sagged a little, the siding flaked at the edges, but the bones were strong. That was what mattered. "They don't know what they're talking about," Lenora said, unloading the last bag. "Let them laugh, we'll see." Eamon didn't answer. He watched the neighbor across the street pause mid-leaf raking to glance at their car, then turn away too quickly. That night, over leftover meatloaf and canned corn, Eamon reread a bookmarked section in his copy of Passive Solar House Planning and underlined a passage. "Insulation is preparation, not panic." He didn't show Lenora the comments calling them fire hazards waiting to happen. At 7:42 a.m. the next morning, the landline rang. It was still the kind with a coiled cord, mounted in the kitchen beside a corkboard full of dentist appointments and old birthday cards. Eamon answered, expecting spam. Instead, a clipped voice. City Code Enforcement. "Mr. Kittredge, we've received a report regarding unpermitted structural alterations on your property. Possible fire risk due to flammable material. A site inspection has been scheduled for Thursday. No name, No space for rebuttal, just a date. Eamon wrote it down on a post-it and placed it beneath the jar of sugar beside Lenora's crossword. He didn't have to say anything. When she came down 20 minutes later, already in her work gloves, she looked at the note, then at his face, and simply nodded once. They didn't need to speak to understand what it meant. Lenora returned upstairs and opened the top drawer of the old secretary desk where she kept clippings, cards, and handwritten recipes. Buried between a church bulletin from 1993 and a faded postcard from their honeymoon in Wisconsin Dells, she found the thing she hadn't touched in years, a torn-out page from the Star Tribune, dated November 2nd, 1991, the aftermath of the Halloween blizzard. She had clipped it because of the photo, a row of people standing in front of a house wrapped in quilts, steam rising from mugs. In the corner, barely visible, a boy with a scraped forehead and a too large winter coat stood beside her. She had circled his name. She had written it down just in case, Miles. That clipping had lived untouched for decades, because some moments don't require revisiting. They live in the bloodstream, surfacing only when a particular kind of fear or grace makes them relevant again. Eamon wasn't the type to dwell on old storms. But he remembered that blizzard, how the gas lines had frozen across half the city, how the metro transit system had shut down for 3 days. How they had used a salvaged Jotol wood stove in the basement to heat the entire house with dry ash logs and stored thermal mass. They'd fed 12 people for 2 nights, neighbors, a mail carrier, and that boy. Eamon remembered him as pale and stubborn, trying to act older than he was. He'd built him a shelf for his backpack. Lenora had sewn a patch on his coat, and now, years later, someone had reported them for fire risk. "We didn't do anything wrong," Lenora said that evening, holding the clipping between 2 fingers like a prayer. Eamon sat across from her, sanding the edges of a salvaged cedar plank, as if shaping the wood could fix what was broken. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "The city's not here for the truth. They're here for compliance." He didn't know yet that truth and compliance would soon become weapons thrown against each other, and that Miles, wherever he was now, might hold the key to both. Over the next few days, the neighborhood's silence grew heavier than words. No one said anything directly, no accusations, no apologies, just eyes that flicked and flinched. At the Wyndham Northeast Library, the front desk clerk who used to chat with Lenora about her reading habits now avoided conversation. At the Quick Trip on University Avenue, the teenager behind the counter snorted when Eamon asked if they carried strike-anywhere matches. "Planning a bonfire?" he'd muttered. They became the punchline of a community that once valued them for their odd resilience, the same resilience now rebranded as backwardness. Even next door, the neighborhood app they barely used had a thread titled "Fire Trap on Jefferson Street," with speculation from people who couldn't point to their house on a map. Eamon read it twice, each line digging into the decades he'd spent quietly repairing the community's porches, walkways, and garden beds. None of that mattered now. All that counted was the viral echo of teenagers mocking the man who thought clay could hold back a Minnesota winter. Lenora baked banana bread for the librarian anyway, left it anonymously. Small acts of dignity, she believed, chipped away at cruelty faster than confrontation. Eamon wasn't sure. He wanted to fight, but against what? A post, a shrug, a culture that measured wisdom in likes and called survivalist instincts cringe. The Thursday of the inspection loomed like a courtroom date. That morning, Eamon sharpened every chisel in his workbench, not because he needed them, but because the act calmed him. Lenora washed the kitchen windows with vinegar and old newspaper, a ritual her mother taught her, while murmuring the crossword clues under her breath. 8 across, to be judged unfairly. She didn't write the answer. They didn't talk about what might happen if the city decided to fine them, or worse, order removal of the insulation. The clay hadn't even fully dried yet. The south wall still had a long vertical seam waiting for its final layer. Around noon, Eamon returned from the Home Depot with a new bundle of straw. At checkout, the cashier had glanced at him twice, then whispered to a co-worker. He pretended not to notice. But that night, before bed, he scrolled through the comments one last time. One said, "Bet that house burns before Christmas." Another had 74 likes. Darwinism in action. He set the phone down, walked to the drawer, and looked again at Lenora's clipping. Her handwriting, Miles, 1991, had faded, but the name remained legible. It was strange how something preserved in silence could suddenly feel louder than 1,000 voices. He closed the drawer carefully, then turned off the light. The cold was coming, and they weren't just building a wall. They were bracing for war. The morning of the pre-inspection arrived without theatrics. No snowfall, no sirens, just a dry cold, whispering across Jefferson Street NE, as if warning what January would soon become. Eamon stood in the backyard by 7 a.m., working the clay with a trowel while wearing his faded Carhartt jacket, the same one he'd worn rebuilding a neighbor's porch after the 2011 tornado. The mud mix he used wasn't decorative. It was a version of cob he'd adapted from an old manual printed in Vermont, reinforced with Portland cement and insulated straw. He'd added a thin layer of lime wash the night before, letting it cure in the crisp air. Every step, every adjustment to the southern wall was deliberate, not because he feared the city's judgment, but because half the neighborhood was waiting to see if he'd fail. Across the alley, a boy in a grey Edison High School hoodie pretended not to stare while waiting for his bus. Eamon didn't acknowledge him. Instead, he pressed another layer of cob into place along the window frame and murmured, "Let 'em laugh." Inside, Lenora moved through the kitchen, folding Afghans and checking lantern batteries. She'd set the stovetop kettle on low at 8:30. It was something her mother used to do just in case company arrived. And today, strangely, it felt like company might. She didn't say a word when she found the inspection notice propped under the sugar jar again, just ran her fingers along the edge of it like she was trying to wear it smooth. By noon, Lenora had resorted the emergency drawer 3 times. Matches, wool socks, batteries, a roll of foil blankets they'd bought years ago from REI in Bloomington. Her pacing stopped when the city-owned Ford Escape pulled up and parked across the street. She watched the man step out. Black wool coat, city emblem over the breast, clipboard under one arm. He paused at the sidewalk, as if trying to recall which house it was. Then he saw the straw-packed walls and didn't need to guess. Eamon had already come around from the backyard, wiping his hands on a towel. "Good afternoon," he said evenly. "I'm Eamon Kittredge. You must be Heikkinen." The man nodded but didn't smile. "Miles, Minneapolis Code Enforcement. We received a call." "Yes," Eamon interrupted, not unkindly. "We heard." Miles didn't ask to come in. He circled the exterior like a mechanic about to write off an old car, tapping the stucco-like surface, eyeing the overhang. "What's this sealed with?" he asked. "Lime and linseed oil," Eamon answered. "Old method, fire-safe." Miles sniffed near the window seam, as if distrust could be inhaled. "You're not licensed, are you?" Eamon shook his head. "Didn't realize you needed a license to keep your own house warm." That was the first time Lenora stepped outside. She carried nothing but wore her late sister's Macy's wool shawl, the one she only brought out when she needed to feel composed. "Mr. Heikkinen," she said softly, "would you like some tea?" He declined, not rudely, but with a stiffness that made her wonder if this man had ever been offered anything without a cost attached. The inspection wasn't long, 22 minutes from arrival to final note, but it felt like a season passed between his first glance and the last click of his pen. Miles jotted observations without explaining them. Eamon, arms crossed, stood near the porch steps. He refused to defend the design unless asked directly. "Your foundations untouched?" Miles asked. "Not compromised." "Electrical?" "Up to code. Panel replaced in 2015. Miles nodded, but didn't make eye contact. His pen scratched against the paper of the city-issued Site Assessment Form 09B, the kind with 5 carbon copies, one of which would end up in a drawer in the Minneapolis Development Review office on 4th Ave S. Lenora didn't interrupt. She watched Miles's face more than his hands. There was something about his mouth, the way he held his lower lip in a hesitant clamp, the occasional twitch in the jawline when he looked at a structural joint too long. It wasn't suspicion. It was memory. Not full recognition, but a ghost of something felt before. He paused at the east wall, noting the way the sunlight bounced off the lime wash. "Interesting texture," he said, mostly to himself. "Breathable," Eamon replied. Miles didn't answer, just scribbled a final note. When he turned back to the porch, Lenora had stepped closer. She looked at the clipboard, not reading it, but seeing it nonetheless, the space between judgment and regulation. "Do you think this is dangerous?" she asked. Her voice was calm, with no trace of pleading. Miles blinked. "It's unconventional," he said. "That's not the same," she replied. As Miles began to leave, Lenora noticed the way he squeezed the pen before tucking it into the breast pocket of his coat. It wasn't just habit. It was how a child would cling to something too small for comfort. That squeeze triggered something buried. Not fully a memory, but an echo. She looked at his shoes, then his shoulders, and finally at his face. "Were you ever on Johnson Street? October of '91? She asked suddenly, not expecting a reply. Miles paused halfway down the porch steps. He didn't turn, didn't respond. Eamon looked up at her, puzzled. Lenora didn't explain. She didn't have to. The moment passed, and Miles reached his car without answering, but his gait changed, slightly, as if a weight had shifted. Lenora stood there clutching the edge of the shawl with both hands. "It's him," she whispered. "I think it's him." Eamon raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" She shook her head. "Not yet, but I remember that boy's eyes." Inside the Ford Escape, Miles sat with the clipboard on his lap. He didn't start the engine. Instead, he looked at the house through the windshield. His eyes moved from the chimney to the mud-sealed seams to the faint outline of Lenora, still standing by the door. He didn't know why, but he wrote down one extra sentence under Inspector's notes. "No immediate hazard observed. Reassess pending conditions." Then he tore off the yellow copy and left it on the passenger seat. The drive back to City Hall took 11 minutes. Miles didn't turn on the radio. At a red light near the grain belt sign, he stared out at the Mississippi, thinking about how some houses aged without rotting, how insulation could be ugly and still work. He remembered flashes, a cold night, unfamiliar walls, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, a smell of burnt wood and cinnamon. But he couldn't place the faces. Or maybe he could, and just didn't want to. When he parked in the back of the city lot, he looked at the clipboard again. The last sentence he'd written felt soft, out of place. He almost crossed it out, but didn't. Instead, he folded the paper and tucked it inside his coat, next to his badge. On the other side of town, Lenora lit a tea candle and placed it in the mud alcove by the living room window, a spot she'd designed to hold light, not for visibility, but for meaning. Eamon unpacked the last bundle of cedar and started shaping the slats for the final layer. Neither spoke about the inspection, but both knew the next step wasn't technical, it was personal. Something had been set in motion. As Miles pulled out of the parking lot, the final image in his rear view was a city he no longer trusted to define what was safe. The warning hit at 4:17 a.m., an aggressive vibration from Eamon's Samsung Galaxy S9, followed by the bold words, "Extreme Cold Warning." He sat up without thinking, legs over the edge of the bed before his feet even registered the floor. Lenora stirred, but didn't speak. They had gone to sleep knowing the temperature might drop, but not this fast, not this hard. On the screen, the alert from Minnesota Department of Public Safety advised immediate shelter. No outdoor exposure beyond 5 minutes. Eamon went straight to the back mudroom and turned on the carbon monoxide detector, then checked the fire extinguisher beneath the sink. Habits built during years of construction sites and winters that tested even the most prepared. Outside, the snow wasn't just falling, it was erasing. The backyard shed was already a shapeless mound. The wind bit through the storm window edges like it had teeth. By 5:10 a.m., the power flickered once, then went out completely. That meant no grid heating, no working sump pump. And by the time they heard the distant pop from near Target Field Station, Eamon already knew what it was. A transformer, blowing. Probably overloaded from space heaters in drafty apartments. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of a neighborhood holding its breath. He moved to the center of the house and placed his hand on the wall. Warm. Still holding. At 6:02 a.m., the first knock came. Not frantic, not aggressive, just hesitant. Lenora opened the door in her robe, and there she was, Marisol Rivas, wrapped in a wet hoodie, holding a child to her chest. The boy's face was grayish, his lips pale, fingers curled and unmoving. Nico, the 5-year-old they had once seen playing with sidewalk chalk near Logan Park. "He won't stop shaking," Marisol whispered. "The window's cracked. The power's out. We didn't know where else to go." Lenora stepped aside without ceremony. She led them to the sofa closest to the west wall, where the insulation held best, and covered the boy with the hand-quilted throw her mother had made in '78, back when Sears still sold fabric by the yard. Eamon brought over the ceramic hot water bottle from the stove alcove, one of 3 they'd warmed before dawn, and tucked it under the quilt at Nico's feet. No one spoke for a long minute. Marisol sat hunched over her son, staring into nothing. Eamon finally broke the silence. "You picked the right house." It wasn't arrogance, it was fact. By 6:40 a.m., the next knock came, then another. By 7:15, they had a queue of neighbors on the front steps. Some they knew, most they didn't. And one, a teenage boy in a Minneapolis North High hoodie, was unmistakably one of the kids from the Menards video. He didn't say a word when Lenora opened the door, just kept his eyes down and held out a flashlight with dead batteries. By 8 a.m., there were 13 people inside. By 9:15, 21. They arranged themselves naturally, without instruction. Elderly tenants from the Pillsbury townhomes, a Somali grandmother from Central Avenue, a young couple with a newborn in a carrier wrapped in an old twins jersey blanket. Eamon took control without raising his voice. He assigned corners for sleeping, designated the dining room as a warming station, placed a note over the kitchen sink. Boiled drinking water. Use kettle only. Every candle was supervised. Every extension cord triple-checked. When someone tried plugging in a propane heater, Eamon unplugged it without a word and pointed to the carbon monoxide detector on the wall. "This house doesn't play games," he said, looking straight at the man. Lenora handled the quiet logistics. Hot tea brewed from Linden Hills co-op bags, spare socks, a handwritten rotation of who should sit closest to the internal thermal mass wall every hour. By mid-morning, they had created a kind of system, not perfect, but human. And when Nico opened his eyes and asked softly, "Is it still cold?" Lenora smiled for the first time in hours. "Not in here, sweetheart, not in here." The guilt came in waves. It wasn't shouted, but it was everywhere, in the way certain people avoided Eamon's gaze, in how others volunteered to sweep the floor or quietly filled pots with melted snow. The teenager from the video, his name was Tyrese, they'd learned, offered to help chop firewood with a rusty Fiskars axe Eamon kept in the basement. "Don't know what I was thinking," he muttered. Eamon didn't answer, just handed him a pair of leather gloves and turned away. Actions mattered now. Not apologies, By noon, the cold had thickened to the point where every breath outdoors felt like inhaling knives. The house, sealed tight and clay-insulated, held at 60 degrees. A miracle given the outside temp had dropped to -22. The radio, battery-powered, crackled from the living room table. HCMC reporting overcrowding, Metro Transit temporarily suspended, rolling blackouts likely to continue past midnight. Nobody panicked, nobody left, because they all knew stepping outside meant risking death. And inside, this once mocked mud house had become a kind of ark. Why is it working? Is it? Someone finally asked. Because it was built to, Eamon replied, not looking up from where he was feeding the stove with small, dry splits of maple. And because no one believed it could. Just after 2 p.m., someone suggested trying to reach out to the city, see if emergency shelters were open. Lenora found an old Nokia TracFone, still with a few minutes on it, and called 311. After 22 rings and 2 disconnects, she reached a human voice. Please hold for emergency updates. No one picked up after that. The line died. Eamon made the call to close the front door, not physically, but logistically. No more past 25. It's not safe. We can't heat beyond that. Lenora nodded. It was cruel, but necessary. Still, they left the porch light on, run by an old Goal Zero solar backup, just enough to signal there was life inside. At 3:45 p.m., there was another knock, and then another. They didn't open. Couldn't. Eamon stood just behind the door, one hand on the doorknob, the other clenched at his side. They'll have to go to Hennepin, he said, or to the church. He didn't sound convinced. He didn't sound anything. It was Miles who shattered the illusion of stability. At 4:10 p.m., his city-issued SUV parked out front again. This time, he didn't wait at the sidewalk. He marched up the porch and knocked with purpose. 1, 2, 3, clipboard in hand, city seal visible, and a look on his face that belonged to someone about to do something against his own better judgment. Miles stepped inside before Eamon could say anything. The warmth hit him like guilt. 25 people looked up, some standing, some seated on the floor, one curled in the hallway between 2 space heaters. The inspector looked around, then directly at Eamon. I have to serve this, he said, unfolding the order. Mandated closure, structural risk, fire potential. Eamon didn't take the paper. He just stared at the man, face unreadable. Lenora came in from the kitchen and saw the form. She didn't flinch. You remember what cold can do to a child, Miles? She asked softly. He blinked once. This is protocol, he said, but even his own voice didn't believe it. Then break it, Lenora said, not raising her tone. Just this once. We're not asking you to build anything. Just let us finish what we started. Miles didn't move. The paper stayed extended, arm rigid. Then slowly he folded it back. I didn't see anything today, he said, but don't make me come back. No one thanked him, not out of rudeness, but because gratitude wasn't the currency of that moment. Survival was. And when the door clicked shut behind him, the house didn't cheer. It just breathed, as if even the walls understood they'd been given time. Miles stepped into the house as if crossing into a different season. The warmth hit him in the chest first, not the kind generated by forced air, but the slow, steady heat of insulation that holds history. His boots squeaked faintly on the old hardwood as 25 pairs of eyes turned to him. Some recognized the coat, the clipboard, the seal. Others only saw what he represented. The city, the rules, the threat. He scanned the room with professional precision, noting the cramped spaces, the open flames of tea lights near thick blankets, the cluster of kids near the stove alcove. The risk was real. It always was in situations like this, but something about the scene, about the silence, made the usual script feel brittle. Evacuate, he said. One word, sharp, final. It floated above the room for a moment like smoke, then landed with the weight of a verdict. Eamon didn't move. He stood just beyond the threshold, jaw clenched, arms at his sides. "We've got a newborn wrapped in a sweatshirt," he said evenly. "We've got a diabetic on the floor, rationing the last of her insulin pens. And we've got no trucks, no hospitals with room, and -30 outside. You still want to evacuate us?" Miles didn't respond immediately. Procedure said yes. Everything else in him said, not yet. The tension didn't break. It rearranged. Some people began to shift, preparing to leave as if surrendering preemptively might soften the blow. Others held their ground, afraid to move, unsure of what came next. Miles hesitated at the edge of the rug, the clipboard heavier in his hands than it had ever been. Lenora stepped forward slowly, moving with a steadiness that forced the room to pause again. Without speaking, she crossed to the vintage sideboard near the kitchen, the one Eamon had restored using salvaged wood from a decommissioned Northern Pacific railcar, and pulled open the narrow drawer beneath the stacked teacups. She removed a worn green notebook, its spine taped with old surgical tape, and held it like it might still pulse in her hands. Wordlessly, she opened to a page marked with a faded paperclip and walked toward Miles. When she extended the paper to him, it wasn't with accusation. It was with something softer, more dangerous. Memory. On the page was a clipped Star Tribune article, yellowed by time. The headline read, "Locals shelter neighbors during historic Halloween blizzard." In the photo, blurred but visible, a boy stood at the edge of a doorway, coat too big, eyes too tired. In the margin, one word written in adolescent scrawl, Miles. He didn't touch the page at first, just stared. His throat tightened, whether from cold or the sudden heat of shame. He wasn't sure. The memory didn't come like a movie. It came like a heartbeat. The door opening, the smell of cinnamon and smoke. Lenora kneeling to take off his soaked boots. Eamon handing him a ceramic mug with 2 hands, saying, "You're safe, son." He had been 12. That year, the snow had closed Broadway Street NE for 3 days straight. His mother hadn't come home. No one filed a missing persons report. No one came looking, except this couple. They hadn't asked questions, just gave him a place to sleep, fed him baked oatmeal with raisins, and let him stay until the phones came back on. "I never said thank you," he murmured, the word surprising even him. Lenora didn't smile. She didn't have to. She just lowered the paper. "You did," she said. "You stayed alive." The moment held. Something shifted, but before it could settle, a familiar figure entered from the hallway, Tyrese, the teenager who had filmed the original video, holding out a cracked iPhone SE with a blinking red battery symbol. "Do you have a charger?" he asked. Miles turned slowly, eyes narrowing as he recognized both the boy and the phone. The screen was still on the paused thumbnail of the viral video. Flintstone couple builds fire trap. Tyrese didn't speak. He just stood there, holding out the phone like an apology he didn't know how to make. Miles didn't take it. He looked at the kid. Really looked. The frost-bitten ears, the chapped knuckles, the tremor in the fingers that wasn't just from cold. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Tyrese blinked, unsure whether it was a challenge or a test. My place is a fridge. Pipes burst. Mom's with neighbors across the river. I didn't know where else to go." There was no swagger in his voice now, no meme-laced sarcasm, just hunger and something softer. Regret. Eamon came over with a folded quilt and draped it around Tyrese's shoulders without saying a word. Miles saw it happen and felt the weight of the form still in his pocket, the violation report, the closure order, the thing that, if filed, would scatter these people into the cold again. He felt the absurdity of it all, how a few lines of municipal code could sentence someone to death during a storm. And suddenly, he wasn't sure who the rules were meant to protect anymore. Lenora didn't break the silence. She just returned to the notebook, slid it back into the drawer, and placed a small rock, the same one from the Halloween blizzard that Miles had once kept in his coat pocket like a talisman. on top. Miles saw it. He remembered it. He had lost it during a snowball fight behind Beltrami Park, and she'd picked it up without saying a word. She'd kept it. All this time. "You held on to that?" he asked. Lenora nodded. Not everything broken has to be thrown out. It wasn't a message. It was a map. He understood now. The choice wasn't between safety and chaos. It was between memory and neglect, between becoming the kind of man who forgets or the kind who remembers. Slowly, Miles pulled the form from his coat and unfolded it. Everyone watched. But instead of reading it aloud or handing it over, he folded it again into quarters and slid it back into the inner pocket of his jacket. "This house is safer than most of the buildings we've got running on generators," he said, not to anyone in particular. "If anyone asks, I didn't see anything." No one clapped, no one cheered, because what had just happened wasn't heroic. It was necessary, and it didn't need celebration, just acknowledgement. Miles stepped back toward the door, glancing once more at the crowd, huddled in makeshift circles. Therese was now curled near the wood stove, eyes closed, phone forgotten. Nico was asleep again, his fingers pink instead of blue. Marisol sipped warm broth out of a chipped Target brand mug. The house no longer felt like a house. It felt like a container of choices, of people who had chosen, against doubt, against pride, to stay. Miles opened the door and let the cold hit him square in the face. It felt different now, sharper maybe, or maybe just real. He descended the porch without looking back. But he knew the image would stay with him, the paper, the boy, the warmth, and he would carry that name again, not just the one written on the clipboard, but the one scribbled in a child's hand 30 years ago. Miles. The boy who was saved. The man who remembered. By the time the city's grid wheezed back to life, it was almost anticlimactic. A flicker, a groan, then light. Some houses on Jefferson Street NE got it first. Others would wait hours. But inside the Kittredge home, no one celebrated. They had survived something larger than just a blackout. The Hennepin County Medical Center ambulance arrived just after sunrise, guided by an old battery-powered camping lantern hanging from the porch. The paramedics, 2 from Station 8 near Nicollet Island, moved fast. They loaded up the diabetic woman first, then a man from 14th Avenue who hadn't stopped coughing since the night before. Nico went last, still wrapped in Lenora's patchwork quilt, cradled by Marisol. The boy clung to her hand like a question he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. Miles helped open the rear ambulance doors. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough. This wasn't supposed to happen. And yet it did. And we were not ready. When the vehicle pulled away, Lenora and Eamon stood shoulder to shoulder. "You think they'll be okay?" she asked. Eamon rubbed the back of his neck. "I think they wouldn't be if we'd followed the rules." That afternoon, Miles returned to City Hall and sat alone at his desk on the 4th floor of the Public Service Building, a blank inspection form in front of him. It was supposed to be routine. File the violation, submit the images, close the case. But this wasn't routine anymore. He pulled up the original report and began to rewrite it from scratch. No mention of non-compliance, no code references in red. Instead, alternative insulation method demonstrated no immediate hazard under extreme weather conditions. Recommend approval for conditional certification. He attached a photo of the interior, time-stamped by his work-issued iPhone 11, and noted the number of individuals safely sheltered during the outage. Then he paused, added a final line. Structure functioned as de facto emergency shelter during grid failure. Consider formal designation for future use. It was a risk, not professionally, but morally. Miles knew that by legitimizing what the Kittredges had built, he was also indicting a system that had laughed at them. But somewhere between that porch and the Star Tribune article now trending online, He'd stopped caring about professional comfort. He hit save, printed the copy, signed it in pen, then folded it once, then again, not just for filing, for delivering. The next morning, Lenora found Tyrese in the backyard, pacing awkwardly between the shed and the compost bin. The snow had crusted over, and his sneakers weren't built for ice. He kept his hands shoved in the pockets of his Vikings hoodie, but the way he lingered said he was waiting for something. Maybe judgment, maybe permission. She approached slowly, not to startle him, but to give him time to choose. He looked down when she stopped near him. "I was a jerk," he mumbled. "Didn't think it would, matter." Lenora didn't answer right away. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper, a handwritten list. "What's this?" he asked. "What's missing?" she said. "From the wall insulation, from the solar backup, from the garden beds for spring." He opened it with trembling fingers. "You want me to help?" She tilted her head slightly. "I think you already started." Tyrese stood still for a second, then folded the paper back with both hands, precise, like it was more fragile than it looked. "I'll come after school," he said. "Every day I owe you." Lenora put a hand gently on his shoulder. "We don't collect debts here, Tyrese. We just fix what we can." Eamon, meanwhile, found himself at a loss. People were showing up, neighbors who hadn't spoken to him in months. A woman from University Avenue dropped off canned goods. A man from Polk Street brought a digital thermometer still in the Walgreens bag. Someone left a copy of the Star Tribune folded neatly on their porch bench. The headline above the photo read, "The Mud House That Held." Eamon stared at it for a long time, not because he was proud, but because for the first time in months someone had written about them without laughing. He tucked the paper into the front of his overalls and went back to splitting kindling. "You're famous now," a neighbor called from across the street. Eamon shook his head. "Fame's cheap. That wall isn't." But inside, something thawed. Not ego, just something softer. Something that believed maybe this neighborhood could still become home again. When a man from the city zoning office emailed asking if Eamon would consult on a pilot for alternative winterization methods, Eamon replied with one line, "Bring coffee and boots." 3 days later, as the worst of the cold snapped and power lines steadied, Miles texted Eamon a time and place. Stone Arch Bridge, 4:30 p.m. Eamon and Lenora arrived just as the light began to slip behind the towers downtown. The bridge stretched across the Mississippi like a quiet witness to everything Minneapolis had been and might still become. Miles waited near the south end, holding a manila folder. He didn't wear his city jacket, just a grey coat zipped high and a navy beanie with Metro Transit stitched across the side. He handed the folder to Lenora without preamble. Inside was the signed conditional approval for their home, stamped, scanned, and archived. Below it, a smaller folded note. She opened it slowly, written in blue ink, shaky but clear. "Thank you for opening the door in 1991. I came back to pay it forward." She clutched the paper in both hands, not crying, not yet, just breathing it in like warmth. Eamon glanced at her and for once didn't need to ask. Miles turned toward the railing, looked out over the water. "I wasn't sure I'd recognize you," he said. Lenora finally smiled. "You did." A few steps away, Marisol stood with Nico, now bundled in a donated Target parka, holding a plastic cup of hot cider from a vendor near Mill Ruins Park. They had no home to return to. The pipes had burst beyond repair, and the landlord had stopped answering calls. Eamon had made the offer the day before wordlessly, by opening the door to the guest room and placing clean towels on the bed. Marisol had stood in the doorway for a full minute before saying, "You sure?" And Eamon, without turning from the hallway, had replied, "It's warm." That was all. Now on the bridge, they stood not as strangers but as something else, something between survivors and family. No one said the word. They didn't have to. The wind had lost its bite. The river still ran black and slow, but even it seemed gentler. They didn't look like a couple mocked online, or a city worker navigating bureaucracy, or a mother abandoned by luck. They looked like what the storm had made them, people who held the door open. And on that bridge, under a sky that no longer threatened snow, they belonged not to the cold, but to each other. What did this story stir in you? Tell us in the comments. If you felt something here, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us keep crafting these heartfelt stories with care. Browse another video after this and share where you're watching from. We read every message.